Daniel sat on the cold pavement at the corner of the busy street. People rushed past him every day, their polished shoes tapping against the concrete, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. He was just another shadow to them, another reminder of what they preferred not to see. His clothes were torn, layered with dust and old stains. His beard was thick, and his hair tangled from months without a mirror or a comb. The city was alive with lights. Tall glass buildings sparkled against the night sky. Cars honked, advertisements flashed, restaurants overflowed with laughter. Yet in the middle of all that wealth and shine, Daniel sat alone with a paper cup in front of him. Sometimes people tossed a coin without looking. Sometimes they wrinkled their noses as if his very presence spoiled their evening. There were days when children tugged at their parents' sleeves, whispering questions about him. The parents always pulled them away quickly. Telling them not to stare, Daniel noticed everything. The quick glances, the forced smiles, and the heavy silence. It was not just hunger he lived with. It was invisibility. Every morning he woke up on the same wooden bench in the park. The morning air was sharp and the grass was wet with dew. His body ached from the hard surface, but he had grown used to it. He stretched, pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, and searched through his small bag. Inside were his only possessions: a worn blanket, a book of music sheets with torn edges, and a photograph. The photo was faded, but it showed a younger man in a tuxedo, standing proudly in front of a piano. Sometimes Daniel looked at the photo for a long time, as if staring at it could pull him back into that world, a world where he had a home, respect, and dreams. But the city did not care about who he once was. The city only saw who he was now. At lunchtime, he often wandered to the downtown square, where businessmen in suits walked quickly with briefcases. Women in high heels clicked past him. The smell of food from nearby cafes made his stomach tighten. He waited near the outdoor tables, not to beg, but hoping someone might leave a half-finished sandwich behind. Many ignored him, but some laughed, some called him names. Once, a group of young men tossed an empty cup at him, as if his life was nothing more than a joke. Despite the cruelty, Daniel rarely reacted. He had learned silence was his shield. He had lived through worse than words. Instead, he sat quietly, his eyes often drifting to the old piano shop across the street. Through the glass window, he could see shiny instruments lined up, grand pianos with polished black bodies, their white keys glowing under the lights. Every time he passed that shop, something stirred inside him, a memory, a longing, a piece of himself that refused to die. One winter night, the wind blew sharply down the alleyways. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter and tried to stay warm under his blanket. A group of people walked past him, their voices loud with laughter. One of them pointed at him and said, "Look at him." "What a waste of space," the others laughed, and their footsteps echoed away. Daniel lowered his eyes, his hands trembling, not from cold but from the sting of their words. He whispered to himself, "They don't know me. They don't know," as he lay back on the bench. Looking at the stars hidden behind the tall towers, he thought about how easy it was for the world to forget a man. One wrong turn, one tragedy, and suddenly you were invisible, no longer Daniel the pianist, but Daniel the homeless still inside him. There was a flame, small but stubborn. It was the flame of music, the flame of talent that life's cruelty had not managed to extinguish. People thought he was broken, useless, forgotten. But the truth was different deep in his mind. Melodies still lived, notes still danced, songs still waited. One day he believed they would hear him, and on that day, the laughter would stop. The city glowed brighter than ever that evening. It was a night of glitter and power. The richest men and women in town gathered inside the tallest skyscraper, a glass tower that touched the clouds. Its lights shone like stars, and the air was filled with the sound of engines from luxury cars pulling up to the grand entrance. Drivers in fine uniforms opened car doors, and out stepped men in tuxedos and women in gowns that sparkled under the chandeliers. Pearls, diamonds, and golden watches flashed everywhere. Laughter rang out. Cameras clicked and reporters crowded the entrance. This was the night of the annual Billionaires Gala, the kind of night where fortunes were displayed as if they were medals of honor. Inside, the grand hall stretched endlessly. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, each one larger than a man. Golden walls reflected light, and tables were covered with dishes worth more than most people made in a year. Chefs in tall white hats hurried back and forth carrying trays of exotic food. The smell of roasted meat, rare spices, and fine wine filled the air. An orchestra sat at the center of the stage, their instruments shining. The violinists tuned their strings, the cellists adjusted their bows, and the conductor raised his baton with quiet authority. As the music began, a soft wave of elegance spread across the hall. The guests nodded with approval, their voices lowering to a respectful murmur. Everywhere you looked, there were conversations about money, stocks, and power. One man bragged about buying another company. A woman laughed about purchasing a yacht larger than her neighbors. Some talked about building new towers, while others whispered about political influence. The language of the night was not friendship or kindness, it was wealth. But outside those giant glass doors, the city was different. Just across the street, Daniel stood quietly, his thin jacket pulled close around him, his eyes fixed on the glowing hall inside. He could see through the glass walls. He saw the chandeliers, the orchestra, the guests raising their glasses. He could even hear faint pieces of the music floating into the night air. It was like watching another world, one that had once been his but was now locked away. People entering the hall noticed him. Some sneered, some whispered jokes. A few laughed openly. "What's he doing here?" One man said. "He doesn't belong anywhere near this place," another replied. Their words were sharp but careless. For them, Daniel was not a man, just part of the street they stepped over on their way to shine. Daniel did not answer. His eyes were drawn to the grand piano at the far end of the hall. Polished, black, beautiful. The same kind of piano he had once played on grand stages. His heart tightened. His fingers twitched as if they remembered the keys. Music rose inside him like a storm. Yet he stood in the cold, separated by glass, watching the orchestra play for people who laughed at him. A group of young elites, dressed in designer suits, noticed Daniel staring. They smirked and called out to him. "Hey, old man, want to come in and play us a song?" Their voices dripped with sarcasm. The others laughed, champagne glasses shaking as they mocked him. Daniel lowered his eyes, but inside a voice whispered, "If only you knew. If only you heard." The orchestra finished a piece. The applause thundered. Crystal glasses clinked. The billionaires cheered. Daniel pressed his hand against the cold glass of the building, feeling the vibration of the music through it. The sound reminded him of a life that was still alive inside his chest, though the world outside saw only rags, hunger, and failure. The laughter of the rich echoed again. One of them joked loudly, "Perhaps we should let him play. He might surprise us with a street performance." More laughter followed, cruel and careless, but little did they know. The night was not going to belong to their money, their diamonds, or their laughter. Something far greater was waiting. As the evening continued, the music grew louder, the room grew brighter, and the guests grew drunker on wine and their own pride. But outside, Daniel stood still, eyes locked on that piano, his soul trembling with something none of them could buy, none of them could own. The hunger in his stomach was nothing compared to the hunger in his heart, the hunger to touch those keys again, to let the world hear what they had forgotten. The billionaires thought the night was theirs, but fate was quietly preparing to write another story, a story that would silence even the loudest laughter in that golden hall, a story where a man the world had thrown away would rise with nothing but the truth of his hidden gift. And so the stage was set. Inside, the music of the orchestra filled the grand hall with perfection. Outside, the silence of one forgotten figure carried the weight of a storm. The night outside the skyscraper grew colder. The wind curled around the corners of the street, tugging at Daniel's worn jacket. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, his tired eyes fixed on the bright hall inside. His stomach growled, but his heart beat faster, not from hunger but from something deeper, something that stirred every time he saw a piano. The guests inside had grown louder as the evening stretched on. Glasses of wine were refilled again and again. Laughter rolled across the golden walls. The orchestra played one elegant piece after another, their music reaching Daniel like a faint echo, a ghost of a memory. He pressed closer to the glass doors, listening, remembering, longing. It was then that one of the guests noticed him, a tall man with slicked back hair and a diamond watch. He leaned toward his friends and whispered something. They turned to look, and soon a ripple of amusement spread among them. "Look at him," one woman said, her voice dripping with contempt. "He's practically glued to the window." Another man chuckled. "He probably thinks this is his concert hall." Their laughter drew more attention. Soon a small group had gathered near the glass, their eyes fixed on Daniel. To them he was not a man but a curiosity, something to laugh at while the night entertained them. Daniel felt their stares, the mockery, the sneers, but he did not look away. He could not. The piano inside pulled him like a magnet, and though their laughter stung, he stood still, calm, silent, as if waiting. One of the younger men, perhaps emboldened by the wine, pushed open the glass door and stepped outside. His suit gleamed under the lights. His shoes shone as if polished that very hour. "Hey, old man," he called out. "What's so fascinating? You've been staring at that piano like it owes you money." The group inside burst into laughter at his words. Daniel glanced at him but said nothing. Silence was his shield. Silence was safer than words. But the young man wasn't satisfied. "Tell me, do you even know what that thing is?" he asked, pointing toward the piano. "Do you even know how to play it, or do you just like staring at shiny objects?" Again, laughter echoed, cruel and sharp. Something inside Daniel stirred, his lips parted, his voice rough from years of disuse. "I can play," he said softly. But the words carried enough weight to silence the laughter for a moment. The young man raised his eyebrows, then smirked. "You can play, really. This I'd love to see." He turned back toward the hall, waving at his friends. "Hey, you hear that? Our guest here thinks he's Mozart." The group roared with laughter. Daniel did not move, his eyes still on the piano, his hands twitching at his sides. Memories rushed back, the sound of applause, the touch of ivory keys, the glow of stage lights. The young man folded his arms and stepped closer. "Tell you what," he said. "Why don't you come in and show us? Let's see what you've got, unless you're all talk." The group cheered at the suggestion, their voices mocking but curious. Daniel's heart pounded. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn and walk away, to disappear into the shadows, but another part of him, the part that had never died, whispered, "This is your moment," with slow, careful steps. Daniel followed the young man inside. The warmth of the grand hall hit him like a wave. The lights were blinding compared to the street outside. All eyes turned toward him. Whispers filled the air. What is he doing here? He's going to embarrass himself. This should be good. Daniel felt the weight of 100 stares, but his eyes did not wander. They locked on the piano, the grand black instrument waiting at the far end of the stage. It seemed to shine brighter than everything else in the room. The conductor frowned, clearly displeased, but before he could speak, one of the billionaires raised a hand. "Let him play," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Let's see what happens." The crowd chuckled in agreement. For them, this was entertainment. Another joke for the night. But for Daniel, it was something else. It was a chance, maybe his last. He walked slowly across the hall, his shoes making no sound on the polished floor. He reached the piano and gently touched the smooth surface. His fingers trembled. The room grew quiet. The laughter softened into whispers. Everyone leaned forward, waiting, ready to mock, ready to laugh again. Daniel closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and placed his fingers on the keys. The weight of years seemed to fall away in that single moment. Outside, the city roared with noise, cars honked, lights flashed. But inside the hall, time held its breath. The encounter was no longer just a meeting of the rich and the poor. It was something larger, something fate had written long before. The forgotten man and the shining piano stood together, and the world was about to change. The grand hall was filled with a strange silence, the kind of silence that comes before either great laughter or great surprise. Daniel stood in front of the piano, his rough hands trembling slightly above the polished keys. The golden light of the chandeliers made his tattered clothes look even more out of place. The crowd of billionaires leaned back in their chairs, wine glasses in hand, eyes sparkling with cruel amusement. The conductor, a stern man in a black suit, frowned deeply. His orchestra sat frozen, instruments resting on their laps. They were waiting for permission. But the richest man in the room, a silver-haired billionaire in a white tuxedo, raised his glass and said with a mocking smile, "Let the poor man play, after all, talent knows no wallet." Or so they say. Laughter followed his words. Sharp and cutting, Daniel's throat tightened. He had spent years hiding in silence, years listening to insults and swallowing his pride. But this moment felt different. It was no longer about food, no longer about warmth. It was about dignity, about proving he was not what they thought. He placed his fingers gently on the keys, but before he pressed down, one man interrupted. Wait, before he plays, let's make it interesting." The billionaire leaned forward. "If you fail, you leave quietly. If you succeed, well, maybe we'll buy you dinner." More laughter exploded. Daniel said nothing, his eyes lowered, but inside him, a storm was rising. The piano gleamed, waiting. Daring him to touch it, one woman sipped her champagne and smirked. "This should be amusing. He looks like he hasn't washed in weeks. How could he possibly know music?" The orchestra members exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others just curious. The conductor finally sighed and stepped aside, giving a reluctant nod. "Very well," he said. his voice heavy with disbelief. "Let him try." Daniel inhaled deeply, closed his eyes, and remembered the last time he had performed. He remembered the crowded theater, the applause like thunder, his fingers moving like wings across the keys. He remembered being someone, being alive. The guests leaned forward, waiting for a disaster. They wanted to see his hands stumble, to laugh at the clumsy noise. But Daniel pressed the first note, and the sound was clear, strong. It echoed through the hall like a bell. The laughter softened, eyebrows raised. He pressed another, then another, and soon a melody began to form, soft, trembling at first, but growing stronger with each note. The crowd shifted in their seats, curiosity replacing mockery, but the challenge was still heavy in the air. It wasn't just a piano he was facing. It was a wall of doubt, a mountain of pride. Every eye dared him to fail. Every smirk waited to tear him apart. But Daniel's hands no longer shook. They began to glide, each finger dancing as if the years of silence had never happened. The young man who had dragged him in whispered to his friend, "He's better than I thought," his voice unsure. The friend shook his head, refusing to believe what he was hearing. "It's just luck, watch, he'll mess up." But Daniel didn't mess up. Instead, the music grew louder, richer, filling every corner of the Golden Hall. The billionaires exchanged glances, their smiles fading. The woman with the champagne lowered her glass slowly. The silver-haired man in the white tuxedo tilted his head. Listening, his mocking smile gone, the challenge had changed. What was meant to humiliate Daniel was now turning into something else. Something they hadn't expected. Daniel felt the music rising from deep inside him. It was not just practice or memory. It was his pain, his hunger, his loneliness, his forgotten years, all pouring out in the language only music could speak. Each note told a story none of the rich could buy, a story none of them could laugh away. But still, some whispered, "He won't last, he'll stop soon. He can't possibly finish." Others sat frozen, their pride battling against the truth in the music. The challenge had been set, but Daniel was not only meeting it, he was breaking it apart, turning their game into his victory. The conductor, once doubtful, now stood straighter, his eyes wide. The orchestra members sat still, captivated for the first time that evening. The hall was silent. No laughter, no clinking glasses, just the rise and fall of Daniel's melody, a melody that wrapped around their pride and silenced it. Daniel opened his eyes briefly and saw them. The very people who mocked him now leaned forward. Breathless, they were listening, truly listening, and in that moment, he knew the challenge was no longer theirs. It was his to prove that talent, dignity, and humanity could not be crushed by wealth or cruelty. He played on, every note a defiance, every chord a reminder that he was more than the rags they saw, more than the hunger they mocked. When his fingers finally rested, the last note hung in the air like a prayer, trembling, beautiful, unforgettable. The hall stayed silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The challenge they had set had been answered, not with words, not with anger, but with music that had cut deeper than any insult could. And in that silence, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years. He felt seen. The final note of Daniel's melody still floated in the air. It lingered like a soft echo, refusing to vanish. The grand hall was frozen. The chandeliers sparkled above, but no one clapped. No one laughed. Even the sound of wine being poured had stopped. Time itself seemed to bow to the music. Daniel kept his hands on the piano for a moment longer, his fingers still resting on the cool ivory keys. He did not lift his head. He did not search for approval. Instead, he let the silence speak. It was heavier than applause, heavier than mockery. It was a silence that carried weight. Slowly, he opened his eyes, and for the first time, he looked at the crowd. Faces that only minutes ago twisted in laughter now sat stunned, mouths parted, eyes wide. The woman who had smirked behind her champagne glass now held it forgotten in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. The young men who had mocked him earlier shifted uncomfortably, their smug grins erased. This was the moment of truth, the line between humiliation and triumph. Daniel had walked into their world as a joke, a shadow they wanted to laugh at. Yet now he stood as something else entirely. Not a beggar, not a broken man, but an artist, a master whose music had stripped away their pride. The silver-haired billionaire in the white tuxedo, who had been the loudest voice of mockery, leaned forward in his chair. His sharp eyes no longer carried amusement, but a strange respect, perhaps even shame. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply stared, trapped by the memory of the melody that had just filled his hall. Daniel breathed deeply, his chest rising and falling. the music still pulsing inside him. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. His heart pounded not from fear but from release. He had given them his soul, poured it out in front of the very people who believed he was nothing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. But the silence stretched on, and Daniel knew this was the test. Would they accept what they heard, or would they cover it with laughter again? Would they admit the truth or bury it under their wealth? This was the moment that revealed not just who he was, but who they were. Finally, a sound broke through. It was not laughter, not mockery, but the sound of hands clapping, soft at first, then stronger. Everyone turned to see the conductor, the very man who had doubted Daniel, now standing tall, his face glowing with awe, his hands coming together in applause. The orchestra followed, their hands joining in. Violins and cellos set aside as musicians rose to their feet, clapping with genuine respect. One by one, more people joined, until the sound grew louder, echoing through the golden hall. Some clapped reluctantly, their pride resisting, but even they could not deny the power of what they had heard. Daniel looked down again, his eyes damp, his fingers trembling not with fear but with emotion. The applause was not the thunderous roar of the theaters he once knew, but it was real, it was raw, and it was enough. The moment of truth had come, and he had met it with music that could not be silenced. The young man who had mocked him the loudest earlier leaned back in his chair. Shaking his head in disbelief, he whispered to his friend, "How is this possible?" But there was no answer. For once, wealth had no explanation, no shield. A woman in a diamond necklace wiped a tear from her cheek quickly. Hoping no one saw, another man whispered, "He plays like he has lived 100 lives." They didn't know the half of it. Daniel had lived hunger, loneliness, tragedy, but also beauty, love, and passion. All of it poured into those keys. Daniel slowly rose from the piano, his legs weak but steady. He gave no bow, no smile, he simply stood there. Breathing in that moment, he did not need their approval, their wealth, or their pity. He had reminded himself who he was, and that truth was louder than anything they could say. The applause continued, some sincere, some forced. But the moment of truth did not belong to them. It belonged to him, to the man who had been laughed at, dismissed, forgotten, yet had risen in the one way no one expected. Not with money, not with power, but with talent so pure it cut through gold. Outside, the city lights still shone, cars still honked, life went on. But inside that hall, something had shifted. Daniel was no longer invisible, no longer just the forgotten figure at the edge of the street. He had reminded them and himself that greatness does not die just because the world stops looking. And as the clapping slowly faded, replaced by whispers and stunned silence, Daniel turned back toward the piano, his hand brushing gently across the polished surface. The music still lived inside him, and tonight, for the first time in years, the world had heard it. The applause faded slowly, leaving the hall wrapped in a strange silence, the kind of silence that was not empty but heavy with thought. Daniel stood by the piano, his chest rising and falling, the music still echoing in his bones, his eyes lowered, his hands trembling slightly from the storm he had just unleashed. The guests sat frozen, their minds struggling to catch up with what they had just witnessed. Only moments ago they had laughed at him, treated him like a joke, yet now, their laughter felt distant, almost shameful. Something inside them had shifted one by one. Their expressions changed. The smirks disappeared, the pride softened. In their eyes there was something new, something they had not expected to feel toward a homeless man. Respect, the orchestra members whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling faintly as if they had discovered a rare treasure hidden in plain sight. The silver-haired billionaire in the white tuxedo leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on Daniel. For years he had believed that money could buy anything, but as he sat there, he realized that what he had just heard could not be bought. No diamond, no gold, no empire could create that kind of beauty. It had to be born in the soul, carved by suffering, polished by hope. A woman in pearls dabbed her eyes with a napkin, embarrassed that she had been moved. She remembered her earlier laughter and felt it burn inside her chest. Another man, a young tech billionaire, clenched his jaw, remembering the cruel joke he had made only minutes earlier. Now it felt like poison. Daniel did not look at them. He did not demand recognition. He simply stood, calm, silent, as though he had already said everything he needed to say. His music had spoken louder than any words could, and the hall had no choice but to listen. The transformation was not in him, it was in them. The billionaires who had come to the gala to celebrate their wealth now found themselves confronted with something far greater, talent pure and raw, beauty that rose from the ashes of suffering. A truth they could not deny. For years, many of them had lived in a bubble, surrounded by luxury, comfort, and power. They believed the poor were weak, lazy, or invisible, but tonight that illusion cracked. They had seen with their own eyes that greatness could sit on a park bench, that brilliance could wear rags, that genius could be hidden behind a beard and tired eyes. The conductor stepped forward slowly, his face pale but glowing with admiration. "Sir," he said quietly, though the whole hall could hear, Would you honor us with another piece?" The guests stirred, surprised. Some leaned forward eagerly. Others sat back, still wrestling with their pride. Daniel looked at the conductor. His lips parted as if to answer, but he hesitated. Part of him wanted to play again, to let the music flow endlessly. But another part of him remembered the cold streets waiting outside. The hunger, the indifference, this hall, this respect. It all felt like a dream. And dreams were fragile. The silver-haired man stood lifting his glass. "You have silenced us all," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. "You walked in here as a shadow, but now you shine brighter than any of us." His words, though heavy with pride, carried a tone of surrender, as if admitting defeat to a man they once dismissed. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others still silent, but the transformation had already begun. Something invisible had passed through the hall, a reminder that talent, dignity, and humanity cannot be measured in wealth. Daniel bowed his head slightly, a gesture of humility. He did not need their praise, their words, or their gifts. For the first time in years, he felt whole again, not because they had noticed him, but because he had reminded himself of who he truly was. Yet the guests could not let go of the moment. Many of them shifted uncomfortably, guilt pricking their hearts. They had mocked him, ridiculed him, dismissed him, and yet he had answered not with anger, not with bitterness, but with beauty. Beauty so powerful it stripped away their defenses. The hall, once filled with pride and noise, was now filled with something else, humility. It was as though the music had reached into every corner, pulling out truths they had buried under gold, truths they could no longer ignore. Daniel slowly stepped away from the piano, his body tired but his spirit alive. He turned toward the glass doors, ready to leave, ready to return to the world outside. But as he walked, voices called out behind him. Voices not mocking but pleading. "Wait," one man said. "Please, don't go," another added. "Stay, play for us again." But Daniel kept walking, his steps steady, each one a reminder that he did not belong to them. They had tried to turn him into a spectacle, but instead, he had turned their world upside down. His transformation was complete, and so was theirs for the rest of their lives. Those billionaires would remember that night. The night they laughed at a homeless man and were silenced by his hidden talent. The night they were reminded that money could buy silence, but it could never buy music that came from the soul. And as the doors closed behind him, the sound of his melody still lingered, haunting, beautiful, unforgettable. The night felt different now. The air inside the grand hall no longer carried the sound of laughter, no longer buzzed with the arrogance of wealth. Instead, it was heavy with wonder, curiosity, and something new that none of them had expected. Respect. Daniel had already turned toward the doors, his figure small against the golden glow of the chandeliers, but whispers began to rise in the crowd, questions that no one could ignore. Who was he? How could a man who looked broken, forgotten, lost, play with such brilliance, such power? The silver-haired billionaire raised a hand, and the room hushed instantly. "Wait," he said, his voice steady. "This man is not what we thought. Someone like him does not appear from nowhere." He turned to the conductor. "Do you know him?" The conductor shook his head slowly, his eyes still wide with awe. One of the guests, a woman in a deep red gown, stood from her chair, her eyes fixed on Daniel. "I've heard that style before," she whispered. "Long ago in Paris, there was a pianist who played with the same soul, the same fire." Her voice trembled as though she were remembering something precious. Others leaned in, curious, confused, their minds searching. Then another guest, older, balding, gasped and pointed. "It cannot be," he said. "Years ago there was a young prodigy, Daniel Hale, trained at the Royal Conservatory. He was brilliant. They said he would conquer the world of music, but then he vanished." The room stirred like a wave crashing, voices overlapping. Could it be true? Could the ragged man before them really be that same Daniel? The name itself carried weight. Many of them remembered reading about him in magazines, seeing his young face in concert programs, his hands compared to legends, his talent praised as once in a generation. Daniel froze at the sound of his name. For so long he had lived without it. Just another shadow, another beggar. But hearing it again brought back a rush of memories. The crowded concert halls, the standing ovations, the proud smile of his teacher, the promise of a future that had been stolen. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting theirs, and in his silence they saw the truth. His face was older, rougher, lined with suffering, but beneath it, they recognized the same Daniel, the prodigy who had vanished. The crowd erupted in whispers, some filled with shock, others with guilt. One man lowered his head, ashamed of the jokes he had made. Another muttered, "All this time." Living on the streets, the silver-haired billionaire spoke again. His voice quieter now, almost humbled. "Is it true?" he asked. "Are you Daniel Hale?" The hall fell silent, every ear straining, every eye fixed on him. Daniel hesitated, his throat dry. His voice soft but steady. "I was," he said, the words heavy with both pride and sorrow. "Long ago, before life took everything from me." The confession hung in the air like thunder. Shaking the room to its core, the woman in pearls gasped, covering her mouth. "But why? What happened?" she asked, her tone no longer cruel but genuinely desperate to know. Daniel's eyes darkened, memories flashing of the accident that shattered his family, the grief that consumed him, the nights he drowned in sorrow, the days that led him to the streets. He did not tell them every detail, but he said enough. "I lost more than I could bear," he whispered, "and with it I lost myself." The hall was silent again. But this silence was different from before. It was not disbelief, not mockery, but sorrow, heavy and sharp for the first time. The billionaires who ruled over towers of glass and oceans of gold saw themselves reflected in him, saw how fragile life truly was, how quickly greatness could fall. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet his, ashamed of the laughter they had thrown at him only minutes ago. Others wiped their eyes, unable to stop the sting of tears. The transformation that had begun with his music now deepened with his truth. The conductor stepped forward again. Bowing his head respectfully, "Maestro," he said softly, using the word as if it were a sacred title. "The world may have forgotten, but your gift has not. It is still here." "Still alive?" The orchestra nodded, some even clapped again, this time not in mockery but in reverence. Daniel stood quietly, his face calm, his voice gentle. "I was lost, but tonight, for the first time in years, I remembered who I was." His words cut through the hall like music, leaving everyone breathless. The silver-haired billionaire slowly lowered himself into his seat, his glass untouched, his pride crumbling. He whispered to no one in particular, "We thought ourselves powerful, yet tonight, he showed us something money could never buy." The words spread like a truth none could deny. In that moment, Daniel was no longer a beggar, no longer a shadow at the edge of the city. He was once again the pianist, the artist, the soul they had tried to bury beneath their laughter, revealed to them in all his broken, beautiful humanity. The revelation burned into their hearts, and none of them would forget it. Not tomorrow, not ever. The hall remained hushed. The chandeliers glittered above, but no one noticed their shine anymore. All eyes were fixed on Daniel, the man who had walked in as a shadow and stood revealed as a light they had never expected. The revelation of his past still echoed in every corner. Whispers of Daniel Hale, the lost pianist, circled through the crowd. Some still shook their heads in disbelief. Others sat frozen, their hearts heavier than before. They had mocked him, laughed at him, treated him as less than human, and yet he had risen above them with nothing but truth and talent. Daniel lowered his gaze, his voice soft but steady. "You laughed at me because you saw only rags. But music does not live in clothes or in wallets. It lives here." He touched his chest, his hand trembling with emotion. "And it will live here until my last breath." The words cut deeper than any lecture, for they came from the same soul that had poured out music moments earlier. Some guests clapped quietly, others wiped their eyes, but many simply sat in silence, realizing that no applause, no gift, no offer of wealth could erase what had happened. This night would live with them forever, not because of the chandeliers or the champagne, but because a homeless man had reminded them of their own humanity. The conductor stepped forward once more, bowing his head. "You are a master, sir," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "Your gift belongs not to the streets, but to the world." The orchestra behind him nodded, some even rising from their seats. Their respect genuine, Daniel smiled faintly, but it was a smile filled with sorrow and wisdom. "Perhaps," he whispered, "but the world chose to forget me, and so I learned to play for myself, for the stars, for the night sky, for anyone who cared to listen." His words carried the weight of years spent invisible. Years spent playing only to silence. The silver-haired billionaire who had mocked him most stood slowly. His face pale, his pride shattered. "We failed you," he admitted quietly. "We failed to see the man before us. And tonight you silenced us not with anger, but with beauty." His voice trembled, a rare break in the armor of wealth. Daniel turned toward the doors again. His steps slow but certain. Some tried to stop him, offering help, offering money, offering comfort, but he shook his head gently. "I do not need your coins," he said. "I only needed you to hear me." Those words struck harder than any refusal could, for they understood then that he had never begged for pity. He had begged for dignity. He pushed open the glass doors, the cold air rushing to meet him, the sounds of the city spilling inside, the honking cars, the chatter of passers-by, the distant music of life that never stopped. He stepped back into the world he knew, the same streets, the same hunger, but tonight, something was different, for inside the hall, those billionaires would never forget. The memory of his music would follow them into their towers, their yachts, their boardrooms. Every time they looked at their wealth, they would remember the man who had nothing but gave them everything. His legacy was not money, not fame, but a melody that pierced their souls. Some of them tried to chase after him, but he was gone, swallowed by the night, his figure fading into the shadows like a ghost. Yet his presence remained, louder than their laughter had ever been. In the days that followed, whispers spread through the city. Stories of the homeless man who silenced billionaires. Some believed it, others thought it a myth. But those who were there knew the truth. They had seen it, heard it, felt it, and no amount of denial could erase the memory. For Daniel, life did not magically change overnight. The streets still waited. The hunger still clawed, but in his heart, something had shifted. He was no longer invisible to himself. He remembered who he was, not just a man in rags, but a pianist, an artist, a soul that could not be silenced. And that was his legacy, not fame, not fortune, but the reminder that talent and dignity cannot be buried forever, that truth always finds a way to rise even in the darkest places. Years later, some of those billionaires would still speak of that night in hushed tones. "Do you remember," they would say, "the man we laughed at, the man who silenced us?" And in their voices there would be shame, but also gratitude, for he had given them a gift they did not deserve. Daniel walked the streets with the same quiet steps, but now he carried a secret victory. He had entered their golden hall and left not defeated, but triumphant. He had shown them the power of music, the power of truth, the power of a soul that refused to die. And somewhere in the night, on some forgotten street corner, when no one was watching, Daniel would sit, close his eyes, and let his fingers dance across an invisible piano, the music rising once more, echoing not for the billionaires this time, but for the stars, for the night sky, and for himself. For he had already left his mark. His legacy was written, not in stone or gold, but in the hearts of those who heard, and it would never be erased.